Every time a country buys oil, settles a trade imbalance, or parks its reserves during a crisis, it reaches for the same currency, not because any treaty currently in force requires it, and not because gold sits behind it in a vault promising redemption. The dollar holds this position because of a 3-week meeting in the summer of 1944 held in a wood-paneled hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, attended by 730 delegates from 44 nations who were, in most cases, still at war. What happened inside the Mount Washington Hotel between the 1st and the 22nd of July that year did not simply rebuild the post-war economy. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. It wired the planet's monetary system to a single currency, controlled by a single government, through a voting formula constructed so carefully that the country writing the rules also held the only vote large enough to block any future change to them. The conference is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a triumph of post-war cooperation. The record kept inside the negotiating rooms tells a narrower story, about which government's economists arrived with the leverage to set the terms, and which arrived needing what that government was prepared to lend. To understand why 44 nations agreed to gather at a resort hotel in the middle of a world war, you have to understand what the previous 25 years of international finance had done to the global economy. The classical gold standard that governed trade before 1914 had collapsed under the weight of the First World War, when nations suspended convertibility to print money for the front. The attempt to restore it in the 1920s failed catastrophically. Britain returned to gold in 1925 at the old pre-war exchange rate, an overvaluation that crushed its export industries and helped drag it into a decade of stagnation. Then came the Depression, and with it a wave of competitive devaluations. Country after country abandoned gold convertibility and let its currency slide, hoping to make its exports cheaper than its neighbors. Britain left gold in 1931. The United States followed under Roosevelt in 1933, revaluing gold from $20.67 an ounce to $35 an ounce, a devaluation of the dollar by roughly 40%. France, tied to a block of gold standard holdouts that included Switzerland and the Netherlands, held out until 1936, before finally letting the franc slide as well. Each devaluation invited retaliation from trading partners, and each retaliation deepened the contraction. Tariff walls rose alongside currency walls. World trade, measured in real terms, fell by roughly 2/3 between 1929 and 1934. Economists on both sides of the Atlantic came out of that decade convinced that a world without coordinated monetary rules was a world that would keep tearing itself apart economically, and by 1944, with the war's end coming into view, both the United States and Britain had already spent 2 years drafting competing plans for what should replace it. The American plan came from Harry Dexter White, the Treasury Department's chief international economist and the principal architect of the position Secretary Henry Morgenthau brought to the table. The British plan came from John Maynard Keynes, already the most famous economist alive, sent to New Hampshire as the intellectual face of a country that was, by 1944, financially exhausted. Keynes proposed something genuinely radical, an international clearing union that would issue its own supranational accounting currency, which he called Bancor, used to settle balances between central banks without any single national currency sitting at the center of the system. Under Keynes's design, both surplus and deficit countries would face pressure to rebalance, so that creditor nations like the United States would be pushed to spend their surpluses rather than hoard them. White's plan looked different. It created a stabilization fund built from member contributions, with the dollar functioning as the practical anchor of the system, convertible to gold at a fixed rate, while other currencies pegged themselves to the dollar. The negotiations over these two visions ran for months before the delegates ever reached New Hampshire, in preliminary talks in Atlantic City and in a long correspondence between White and Keynes that survives in the archives of both treasuries. Keynes fought hard. He was, by most accounts of those in the room, intellectually the sharper man. But intellectual force was not what decided the outcome. Leverage was. By the summer of 1944, the United States held somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the world's monetary gold reserves. It was the only major economy whose industrial base had grown rather than been bombed into rubble during the war. It was the creditor to nearly every Allied government at the table, including Britain, which owed the United States enormous sums under Lend-Lease, and would spend years afterward negotiating the terms of that debt. Keynes could argue the technical merits of Bancor for as long as he wanted. Britain needed American capital to survive the transition to peace, and a country that needs your money does not get to design the system your money will run on. White's plan won, not because it was more elegant, but because the delegation proposing it represented the only government in the room that did not need anyone else's permission to walk away from the table. Out of the conference came two new institutions: the International Monetary Fund, designed to provide short-term balance of payments support and enforce the new exchange rate rules, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which the world now knows as the World Bank, designed to fund the physical rebuilding of Europe and Asia. Both were headquartered in Washington, a detail that was not incidental. Both were funded through a quota system, where each member nation's financial contribution and its voting power was calculated according to a formula weighted by national income, gold reserves, and trade volume, all of which placed the United States at the top by a wide margin. Keynes's Bancor proposal had another obstacle beyond American gold reserves and British debt, one rarely mentioned in retellings that focus only on the two governments. A supranational clearing currency, settled bank to bank through an international union rather than through the correspondent banking networks that ran through New York and London, would have sidelined the commercial banking system that had spent decades building its business around financing international trade in national currencies. The private American banking establishment, represented informally at the conference through advisors with close ties to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and to firms including Chase National Bank and the House of Morgan, favored White's dollar-centered design for the same reason the Treasury did, because it preserved New York's position as the clearinghouse through which the world's trade finance would continue to flow. Edward Brown of the First National Bank of Chicago and Leon Fraser, former president of the Bank for International Settlements, both served as advisors to the American delegation, and both pushed consistently against any plan that would have routed international settlement through a mechanism the private banking sector did not control. Keynes noticed the pattern and complained privately, in letters to colleagues back in London, that the Americans treated the conference less as a negotiation between equals than as a ratification exercise for decisions the Treasury and the New York banks had already reached before the delegates ever boarded their trains for New Hampshire. The record supports him. Every substantive compromise reached at Bretton Woods moved the final agreement closer to the American draft and further from the British one, and every institution that emerged from the conference, the fund, the bank, the dollar gold peg, left the private financial infrastructure already centered on Wall Street, exactly where it had been before the war, now backed by the full weight of the post-war international order rather than merely by pre-war habit. The quota formula is where the suppressed part of this record actually lives, because the formula did something the public discussion of Bretton Woods rarely mentions. Major decisions inside the new fund required an 85% supermajority of the weighted vote. The United States, at founding, controlled roughly 28% of that vote on its own. No other single country came close. The arithmetic meant something specific and durable. No structural change to the fund, no revision of its rules, no alteration of the quota system itself could pass without American consent, regardless of how every other member voted. It was not called a veto in the founding documents. It functioned as one from the first day the doors opened, and it still functions as one today, more than 80 years later, through a threshold that has been adjusted over the decades but never removed. The dollar's role received the same quiet permanence. Under the Bretton Woods rules, the dollar was the only currency in the system directly convertible into gold, and even that convertibility was restricted to foreign central banks, not private citizens or companies, at a fixed rate of $35 to the ounce. Every other member currency pegged itself to the dollar, adjustable only with the fund's approval. In practice, the world's money was now denominated in dollars, redeemable in theory for gold that mostly sat in vaults at Fort Knox and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, in a system that made the dollar function as though it were gold itself, for every government and central bank on Earth except the one that issued it. The delegates signed the Articles of Agreement in the final days of July, and ratification followed over the next 2 years as the war ended and the new institutions prepared to open their doors. The fund and the bank formally began operations in 1946, headquartered a few blocks apart in Washington, and the early years of the system exposed a problem the American delegation had not fully anticipated, or had perhaps anticipated and quietly welcomed. Europe emerged from the war so devastated and so dependent on American goods to rebuild that the rest of the world found itself desperately short of the one currency it now needed to settle its accounts. Economists at the time called it the dollar shortage, and it was severe enough that the framers of the Bretton Woods Agreement had actually written a safeguard against the opposite scenario into the Articles, a provision known as the Scarce Currency Clause, which allowed the fund to formally declare a currency scarce and permit member nations to discriminate against it through trade restrictions. The clause was drafted with an eye toward protecting the world from being starved of dollars. It was never invoked. Instead, the United States addressed the shortage on its own terms, through the Marshall Plan, announced in 1947 and passed by Congress in 1948, which sent roughly $13 billion in aid to rebuild Western Europe. The aid arrived denominated in dollars, spent overwhelmingly on American goods, and shipped on American vessels, which meant that the same program remembered today as an act of post-war generosity also functioned as a mechanism for entrenching the dollar's role in every economy it touched. Every recipient government that spent Marshall Plan dollars was, in the same transaction, building the habit of holding and transacting in the currency the new system had already made central. By the early 1950s, the dollar was not simply the anchor of the Bretton Woods system on paper. It was the working currency of global trade, the reserve asset every central bank wanted to hold, and the instrument through which American economic policy could be felt in the daily transactions of countries that had no vote large enough to object. The imbalance built into the system was not an accident of post-war circumstance. It traces back to the drafting itself. Harry Dexter White's Treasury staff produced the technical formula used to calculate each nation's quota, the same formula that determined voting weight, and that formula was published as an American proposal in April of 1943, more than a year before delegates gathered in New Hampshire, which meant the terms of the debate were set before the debate began. Keynes and the British delegation spent the Atlantic City preliminary talks and the Bretton Woods Conference itself arguing within a framework the Americans had already built, adjusting variables rather than rewriting the structure. The pattern would repeat for decades. When the fund's quotas were reviewed in 1959, in 1965, and in every general review since, the recalculation has consistently preserved the same basic hierarchy, with the United States positioned just above the threshold required to block any amendment on its own. As recently as 2010, a major quota realignment intended to give China and other rising economies a voting share closer to their actual weight in the global economy sat stalled for 5 years because the reform required ratification by the United States Congress, and Congress did not act until 2016. The institution built to manage the post-war monetary order still runs, in its structural bones, on a veto written into its founding formula by a Treasury economist working out of Washington in the spring of 1943. What most retellings of Bretton Woods leave out is who that economist actually was, and what he was doing in the years before he sat down to draft the document that would determine how the post-war world settled its debts. Congress ratified the Bretton Woods Agreements Act in July of 1945, after a debate in which several senators, including Ohio's Robert Taft, raised concerns about ceding American monetary sovereignty to an international body run by unelected technocrats in Washington. Those objections dissolved once Treasury officials walked the relevant committees through the actual voting arithmetic, and it became clear that no policy of the new fund could ever be adopted over American objection. The bill passed the Senate by a wide margin, and the concerns that had briefly threatened it were never raised again in quite the same way, because the men voting on the bill understood, even if the public explanation of the agreement never said so directly, that they were not surrendering control of anything. Keynes returned to London and spent what remained of his life negotiating a separate and far less favorable arrangement, the Anglo-American Loan of 1945, in which Britain secured a line of credit from the United States on terms that required it to make sterling freely convertible within a year, a condition that triggered a run on the pound so severe that convertibility had to be suspended within weeks of taking effect. Keynes died in April of 1946, not yet 63 years old, worn down by a decade of wartime negotiation that had ended with the country he represented finically dependent on the government, whose delegation had outmaneuvered him at every turn. The dollar system he had tried to prevent from becoming absolute was, within 2 years of his death, the only system left standing. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The man on the other side of that negotiation did not outlive Keynes by long, and the manner of his own death would eventually reopen the entire question of what he had actually been doing in Washington during the years he was drafting the post-war monetary order. Harry Dexter White had been under quiet investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation since 1945, based on allegations from 2 separate defected Soviet couriers, Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley, both of whom named White as a source who had passed Treasury information to Soviet intelligence throughout the early 1940s, the very years he was drafting the plan that would become the Bretton Woods system. At the time the allegations surfaced, White was serving as the first American executive director of the International Monetary Fund, the institution he had built from the ground up, sitting inside the organization whose voting architecture he had personally engineered to keep control in Washington's hands. The Truman administration, informed of the allegations by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover in November of 1945, allowed White's nomination to the fund position to proceed anyway, and he held the post for a little over a year before resigning in 1947, officially citing health concerns. What actually happened to the man who wrote the rulebook for the modern financial system, and what the record eventually confirmed about who he had really been working for while he wrote it, did not surface publicly for another year, and even then it surfaced in a room that had nothing to do with international finance. On the 3rd of August 1948, Whittaker Chambers appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee and named White among a list of government officials he alleged had passed material to a Soviet espionage network during the 1930s and 40s. White demanded the chance to respond, and on the 13th of August he testified before the same committee, under oath, denying every allegation and describing himself as a loyal New Dealer whose only ideology was American democracy. He looked, by the account of reporters present, exhausted and ill. Elizabeth Bentley, a former Soviet courier who had defected and begun cooperating with the FBI in 1945, had already told investigators a similar story 2 years earlier, describing White as a contact who supplied information through an underground network run out of the apartment of fellow Treasury economist Nathan Silvermaster, a network Bentley had personally serviced as a courier between 1941 and 1945, the exact years White was drafting the plan that became the American position at Bretton Woods. 3 days later, on the 16th of August 1948, Harry Dexter White died of a heart attack at his farm in New Hampshire, less than 50 miles from the hotel where he had drafted the founding document of the post-war financial order 4 years earlier. The question of whether Chambers and Bentley had told the truth remained officially unresolved for nearly half a century, treated by many historians as an unproven accusation against a man no longer alive to contest it. That changed in 1995 when the National Security Agency declassified the Venona files, a collection of intercepted and decrypted Soviet intelligence cables from the 1940s that had been kept secret for decades. The Venona traffic identified a Soviet intelligence source inside the Treasury Department using the cover names Lawyer and Richard, and the cable's internal details, cross-referenced against White's travel, his access, and the timing of his communications, matched no other Treasury official as closely as they matched White. The consensus among historians who have examined the declassified material since is that White did pass sensitive information to Soviet contacts, most likely believing he was assisting a wartime ally rather than betraying his own country, and that his motives were closer to ideological conviction than financial gain. None of that history appears in the standard account of Bretton Woods taught in economics courses, where the conference is remembered as an act of technical diplomacy between two brilliant economists. The technical diplomacy was real. So was the fact that the American half of it was conducted by a man under active Soviet contact at the same time he was constructing the voting formula that would anchor American financial power in the institutions he helped design, formulas he built to serve the government he worked for even as he was, according to the cables that outlasted him, working for another one as well. The first real test of the adjustable peg came only 3 years after the fund opened its doors. Britain, still rationing basic goods at home, and drained by the cost of holding on to an empire it could no longer afford, ran persistent balance of payments deficits through the late 1940s that pushed its dollar reserves toward exhaustion. In September of 1949, Chancellor of the Exchequer Stafford Cripps devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80, a cut of just over 30%, executed with almost no advance consultation with the fund, whose entire purpose was supposed to be managing exactly this kind of adjustment. 23 other countries devalued alongside Britain within days, most of them former colonies and trading partners whose currencies were pegged to sterling rather than directly to the dollar, which meant a decision made in London to protect British reserves rewrote the exchange rate of economies from Australia to Ceylon without their governments having much say in the timing. The episode confirmed something the American delegation had assumed all along, and the British delegation had spent 3 weeks in New Hampshire trying to avoid admitting, that the post-war monetary order had exactly one currency stable enough to serve as its anchor, and every other currency, including the one that had financed a world war and still governed a global empire, would adjust around it rather than the reverse. The system White built outlived the questions about the man who built it, and for roughly 2 decades it worked close to as intended. Western Europe rebuilt. Japan industrialized under a fixed exchange rate to the dollar. Global trade expanded at rates the interwar period had never approached. But the structural flaw at the center of the arrangement, the one that made the dollar simultaneously a national currency and the world's reserve asset, took until 1960 to receive a formal name. That year, the Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin testified before Congress and laid out what became known as the Triffin dilemma. For the rest of the world to have enough dollars to conduct trade and hold as reserves, the United States needed to run persistent balance of payments deficits, sending more dollars out into the world than it took back in. But the more dollars accumulated in foreign central banks relative to the fixed stock of gold in Fort Knox, the less credible the promise became that every one of those dollars could actually be redeemed at $35 an ounce. The system needed the United States to spend beyond its means to function, and the more successfully it functioned, the less anyone should have believed the underlying promise. By 1965, French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had a name for the position this put the United States in, calling it the exorbitant privilege, the ability to run deficits, print the reserve currency, and export the resulting cost of adjustment to every other country holding dollars. President Charles de Gaulle acted on the observation directly, sending French naval vessels to New York to physically collect gold in exchange for French-held dollar reserves and pressing other allies to do the same. Foreign-held dollars had grown so far beyond the American gold stock by the mid-1960s that the United States and 7 other central banks formed the London Gold Pool in 1961, pooling reserves to intervene in the market and hold the price at $35 an ounce artificially. The pool held for 7 years. It collapsed in March of 1968, when demand for gold conversion outpaced what the participating banks were willing to keep supplying, and the arrangement was abandoned. By 1971, the arithmetic Triffin had described a decade earlier had become undeniable. Foreign dollar liabilities exceeded the entire American gold reserve by a wide margin, and the pressure to convert accelerated as speculation mounted that Washington would eventually be forced to break the peg. On the 15th of August 1971, President Richard Nixon announced in a televised address that the United States would suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold, a move that came to be known as the Nixon shock. It was framed publicly as a temporary measure. It was never reversed. The Bretton Woods system, in the form the delegates had signed in 1944, ended that night. What did not end was the dollar's position at the center of the global system it had built. Freed from the gold peg, the dollar continued functioning as the world's dominant reserve and trade currency, now backed by nothing more than confidence in American institutions and the sheer scale of dollar-denominated debt, contracts, and reserves already embedded across the global economy. In 1974, American officials negotiated an arrangement with Saudi Arabia under which oil exports would continue to be priced and settled in dollars, an agreement that gave the post-gold dollar a new anchor in the one commodity every industrial economy needed to buy. The system had lost its promise of convertibility and kept its central position anyway, because the architecture Bretton Woods had built around the dollar, the reserve holdings, the trade invoicing, the voting formulas at the fund, had already made switching away from it more costly than continuing to use it. The attempt to save the fixed-rate system did not end on the night of the Nixon shock. In December of 1971, finance ministers from the Group of 10 industrial nations gathered at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and negotiated a revised set of exchange rates, devaluing the dollar against gold from $35 to $38 an ounce, a realignment President Nixon called the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months. Speculative pressure against the dollar resumed almost immediately, and in February of 1973, Washington devalued again, to $42.22 an ounce, a rate that exists on the books to this day only as a legal fiction, since no one has been able to redeem a dollar for gold at any price since 1971. By March of 1973, the major industrial currencies abandoned fixed rates altogether and began floating against one another, ending the Bretton Woods exchange rate mechanism in practice 3 years before it ended in law. The legal ending came in January of 1976 at a meeting of the fund's members in Kingston, Jamaica, where the IMF Articles of Agreement were formally amended to legalize floating exchange rates and to strip gold of its official role in the system entirely, demonetizing the metal that the 1944 agreement had placed at the center of everything. The fund sold roughly a sixth of its own gold holdings in the years that followed, distributing part of the proceeds to developing member nations. The institution, built in 1944 to defend a fixed gold price, had, within 32 years, formally written that price out of its own founding charter, while leaving the voting formula that determined who controlled the institution completely untouched. That voting formula has gone on doing exactly what it was built to do. When the debt crises of the 1980s swept through Latin America, and again when the financial crisis of 1997 tore through Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea, it was the fund's executive board that approved the emergency lending and set the conditions attached to it: austerity measures, interest rate policy, privatization requirements, and each of those approvals passed through a boardroom where the United States held, and still holds, a share of the vote no other single nation could match. In 2010, the fund's members negotiated a quota realignment intended to give China, then already the world's second-largest economy, a voting share closer to its actual weight in global output. The reform could not take legal effect without ratification by the government holding the blocking vote, and the United States Congress did not ratify it until December of 2015, 5 years after the rest of the membership had agreed to it. China's voting share today remains well below its share of global economic output, while the American share has been managed, review after review, to stay just above the level required to preserve the veto first built into the arithmetic in 1943. The institutions signed into existence at the Mount Washington Hotel are both still open for business, still headquartered a few blocks apart in Washington, still governed by quota formulas descended in a direct structural line from the one Harry Dexter White's staff published in April of 1943. The United States still holds a voting share above the threshold required to block major reform on its own. The dollar, decoupled from gold for more than 50 years now, still sits at the center of global reserves, global trade invoicing, and the balance sheets of central banks on every continent, not because any nation voted for that outcome in any meaningful sense, but because a conference held under wartime urgency in 1944 built the plumbing that every subsequent decade of global finance has simply continued running through. Central banks from Brasilia to Beijing hold the bulk of their reserves in a currency whose issuing government they cannot outvote inside the very institution created to referee the system, an arrangement that has outlasted the war that produced it, the gold standard it was built to preserve, and the man who wrote its founding arithmetic before anyone in the room knew where his actual loyalties lay. The conference is remembered as the moment the world agreed to cooperate. The formula it left behind tells a more specific story, about who held the leverage in the room, who wrote the arithmetic, and how completely a system built in 3 weeks can outlast every government that ever sat at its table. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.